It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Sam Lewitt, who's an artist based in Berlin. Recent solo exhibitions of his include at Miguel Abreu Gallery, Galerie Buchholz, Z33 House of Contemporary Art, Swiss Institute in New York, Kunsthalle Basel, CCA Waters, Institute of Contemporary Art in San Francisco. His work has also been featured in major group exhibitions such as the Dunkirk Triennial of Contemporary Art and Industry at MoMA, New York, Centre Pompidou, the 57th Venice Biennial at the Vienna Secession, Kunsthalle Bergen, and the 2012 Whitney Biennial, amongst others. For his lecture, As Ever, Nitrates and Navigation, Hanne Darboven's house marks a point on the map in Harburg, a borough of the Hanseatic city of Hamburg. This lecture takes its cue from the administrative templates, calendrical structures, and grid systems that define Darboven's work, treating these forms as models for the directional flow of writing. In turn, these flows index the movement of objects through networks of trade, exploitation, and accumulation. The aim is to magnetize the location of Darboven's house as though it were a compass, guiding us through the administrative rationality of mercantile culture, the material history of saltpeter extraction that shaped the region's cycles of wealth, and the municipal architecture and urban planning that at once glorify and mystify this legacy. Welcome, Sam.
Well, thank you, Milan. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank everyone at the Kunstverein, especially Milan, for inviting me, and also everyone at the Hanne Darboven Stiftung. It's really terrific to be able to walk into this house finally after wondering for so many years what it was like, and I'm very glad that this will continue as a collaboration in some form. I also want to thank all of my co-presenters. I feel like I've learned a tremendous amount today, and I hope that I can follow in some appropriate manner. I just want to clarify that I'm approaching Darboven's work as an artist and not a historian or a writer. This means that I don't necessarily feel the pressure to get it right. Rather, I'm more curious about how Darboven's work comes into contact with other kinds of aesthetic, historical, and critical forms that may be anachronistic or somehow inappropriate to her work in a strict sense, although I hope not too inappropriate. Lucky for me, Darboven's work has and continues to provide a very demanding and a very rich resource, as obviously it has for many people here, which is indexed in how many people are actually here. So anyhow, I hope I can do it justice in some particular way. So we'll start with this. There's a letter, a gift from Lawrence Weiner to Darboven, which hangs alongside a small collection of epistolary objects from Weiner in the house. It reads, "Dear Hanne, as ever, caught between ships, passing in the night, Lawrence." 13 years before the arrival of this letter in 1986, in the opening pages of her work, Evolution Leibniz, Darboven uses a similar set phrase. She writes, "And no more words, a day's accounting, and still one world, und noch eine Welt." There's nothing remarkable about either of these idiomatic expressions, as ever and still. Taken together, however, and in the direct geographical and historical context of Darboven's house, something interesting happens. This is notwithstanding references to nautical cliches in Weiner's letter, his ships in the night, and the global contours of Darboven's invocation of a numerically encompassed world, a day's accounting, and still one world. As ever and still function as adverbs. Each modifies an implied verb or state of being. In each case, this state is an expression of continuity or consistency. Something persists. Friendship and calculation, belonging and absence, the foreclosure of speech. Grammatically the same then, yet we arrive relatively fast at the possible differentiation of semantic moods between the two. And here's an image of some of the pages from Evolution Leibniz. Wiener's as ever is a euphemism indexing a persistent duration which coheres through time. Here the subject is an affirmation of something negative, a missed encounter, figured with appropriate maritime reference. Darboven, for her part, indicates a more encompassing terrain for this constancy, and still one world is an evocation of spatial unity. Despite Darboven's Eliatic tone, a tone that runs throughout a lot of the work, all of the work really, I read a kind of insistent surprise, approximating what in grammar is called a modal particle, more a responsive intonation of but yes, more a doch than a noch, than an authoritative nonetheless. What of this surprise that the world hangs together, or the constancy that inheres in the missed encounter? What have they to do with this house? What this house holds is heterogeneous, mercurial, assembled into discrete tableaux, bridged by moments of lesser organizational structure. In each case, its contents are bound without the tight stitching that sutures our focus to its microcosms by way of a foregrounded type of object, although it must be admitted that children's toys have a certain outsized presence. And here, Kirsty, I took the same picture, but I think yours is better than mine. The choice to hang work on the ceiling is particularly interesting, as if to impose a global matrix from above, which at once gathers and throws into relief the explosion of representational structures below. This house, I want to claim, does not contain a collection. Instead, collections emerge from it into Darboven's work, where they are supertitled and integrated, mapped to a thematic subject. The house is a site of navigation and preservation, and I'll return to these terms in what follows. Here's more Evolution Leibniz. This perhaps answers for my sense that there's an adverbial quality even of the objects pulled, presented, often produced on her direct instruction for various works, such as the white horse that Kirsty showed, or this strange approximation of a dinosaur. Let's see. Oh, I missed the dinosaur. There it is. Okay, about 9 years ago, I gave a talk as part of Dia's Artist on Artist series dealing with Darboven's Kulturgeschichte 1880 to 1983. I argued there, among other things, that her work stages a deconditioning of part-whole relationships. It unsettles distinctions between viewing and reading. The systematic nature of her writings is always in tension with the particularity of the materials that she collects. Even as graphic details are absorbed into her grids, they resist full subsumption in presence of deviations and lacuna, shifts in visual register and jumps in subject matter. The details articulate the very texture of the grid while striking out against its order. This very quickly imposes a sort of ethico-political dimension on the purely logical problem of part-whole relations, the latter of which is termed mereology in the language of formal logic. To comprehend the question of parthood as an expression of the status of individual autonomy and the experience of social heteronomy understands logic, formal logic that is, not only as a method of cognition, which is indispensable for sure, but also potentially a form of social domination. On this account, the formal categories of reason do not simply take on the attitude of historical names, standards, structures of power, and suppositions about free action as examples of purely logical structures. It is rather those social categories themselves which are discretized as ideal units that turn back on thought, giving it a false unity. Having lost its integral link to social action, this instrumental rationality becomes an abstract tool for the administration of people. In the talk focusing on Kulturgeschichte, I focused on Darboven's enactment of an unresolved tension in the power of representational systems to organize and govern their material. This comes down to defining a nexus of mediating moments between part and whole, of which the administrative grid, the calendar, these sorts of things are examples. In this talk, I want to replace the philosophical language of mediation with that of infrastructure. The mapping logics, transit systems, urban planning, the material vectors that coalesce into addressable information that move from climatic measurement to the app I used to hail a taxi here. These infrastructures operate, indeed, in terms of a gridded lattice of maps run by computational systems. They exist to assign an address. In this, I'm not going to go into any real depth about any specific work by Darboven. I prefer to take this occasion to speak about her formal structuration in those grids, those matrices, those accounting systems, and I want to do so from a geographic perspective. While Darboven's work utilizes the type of international standards of graphic order on the scale of the hand, I would like to try an experiment in the following. To dilate the lens and view these formations from the graphic space of cartography. After this, the depth of field will close again to focus on this particular region on the global map, to discuss Hanseatic navigational and financial infrastructure, and maybe its relationship to the present, its mark on this city, and its relationship to this address. This cartographic perspective is not foreign to Darboven. In 1986, incredibly, the same year that she produced Evolution Leibniz, she also made Erdkunde 1, 2, 3. This work consists of over 700 wall-hanging panels. Each comprises 4 collage sheets of calendar pages, articles, drawings, and photographs, as well as 10 freestanding wooden classroom displays. The composition is divided into 3 parts that are structured by indices. There are always indices in these large-scale works. The index panels of the first part of the installation present black and white photographs of this house and her studio. Visible within the photographs are rolled and unrolled educational maps among her other items, including a bust of Alexander von Humboldt, the 18th century pioneer of empirical geography. Further index pages include transcriptions from the Brockhaus Encyclopedia derived from the entries for Erde and Erdkunde. The work also contains installation shots of Kulturgeschichte displayed at the Musée de la Vie de Paris in 1985, as well as collage notes on the work's structure and folkloric illustrations of global technological achievements that are fixed on display boards. A typical montage of isolated fragments then, indicating encyclopedic objectivity and autobiography, commingle in Erdkunde 1, 2, 3. abruptly soldering together logics of ordering and documenting cartographic scales. What we are confronted with here is a scientific worldview presented without necessary rational order. Geography becomes, in some sense, not a discipline whose order of representation guides conventions of literacy for the retrieval of location. Rather, we confront a representational field whose order shifts between registers of perception that recall more the necessary adjustment of legibility between the content of a map and perhaps the obsolete allegorical figures that used to decorate them. So what of this formation of the map as an infrastructure of graphic literacy? And now I'm going to refer to the most unsympathetic intellectual referred to today, and perhaps one of the most unsympathetic intellectuals of the 20th century, and I hope that it becomes clear why I'm talking about him. So there we go. Let's stick with that. In the Nomos of the Earth, Carl Schmitt argues that the scientific worldview, which mapped the globe with its smooth navigational geometries of meridians and parallels, at the same time propelled the appropriation of the Earth's surface. Schmitt uses nomos, a term he traces to the Greek for law and distribution, to mean the foundational act of taking and ordering space, which underlies the emergent modern legal order. In this brutal picture, every significant epoch in world history begins with Landnahme, a land appropriation, that divides and allocates territory, thereby creating a new nomos, or spatial order. The discovery of the New World in 1492, for example, precipitated a revolutionary reordering of global space. European powers, by taking vast overseas lands, established an international juridical technics, jus publicum Europaeum, grounded in a global spatial division under European domination. In this intensely geopolitical picture, the first truly global legal order is forged when European colonial powers partitioned the non-European world among themselves. And crucially, this nomos was not just about asserting power. It was literally about inscribing that power onto the map of the world through graphic systems, inscribing lines and grids, orthogonal geometries, and axial divisions, which had the epistemic impact of fundamentally reordering the concept of space itself. Space was now addressed to appropriation and the so-called primitive accumulation of resources. While Darboven does not, indeed would never, focus on either the legal structures, let alone the historico-juridical critique implied in this story about the violent distribution of the globe, it does answer for something that is fully on display in the work, I think. It tells us about the formation of the abstract linearity and scalability of the map and its graphic organization, which she recurrently focuses on, with its coordination of orthogonally organized space, as if that method of representing space was neutral, natural, and objective. This nomos is a spatial logic that delineates martial territories, spheres of influence, and zones of control. Cartographically, nomoi are visible in borders, colored regions, cadastral grids, all the graphic devices that imply authority and ownership carved by the graphicules of map making. Graphicules is a horrible English word, which essentially just means like the graphic artifacts that go into dividing the maps and globes. It is space as governed in distinction to the anomy of lawless seas by the decree of sovereign administration and enclosure. Perhaps Darboven's shifting lines and scales of legibility introduce us to something different, not not the graphic implications of a nomos of the earth, but something like a dromos of the map. Dromos, meaning road, path, or race, implies motion and traversal as opposed to enclosure and settlement. It presupposes a straight navigational trajectory, not as something taken or possessed, but as something crossed. It indexes the infrastructure of movement, vectors rather than enclosures, lines that carve areas rather than the areas themselves. Dromos signifies spatial experience as navigation, the condition of being en route. Darboven's dromos are expressed in writing as a crossing of the page with asemic script, a directional movement across the grid rather than a static dwelling within its governing terms. She articulates a fundamental tension within the map as a diagram of order and as a record of movement. Nomos marks where authority settles. Dromos marks how life passes through. Nomos draws the map. Dromos crosses it. Whether nomos or dromos, we are still in the political space of what Schmidt terms global linear thinking, which is in need of some unpacking. The political space of a globe sliced up with coordinates can only exist in the form of a map. The graphic artifact is the reality of the abstract apportionment of its terrain. Colonial treaties routinely used straight lines to divide land. A prime example was something like this from the Treaty of Tordesillas from 1494, which split the non-European world between Spain and Portugal by an imaginary, entirely factitious north-south meridian. For the first time, territory lost any orographic specificity. These geometric boundaries ignored the lived geographies of language, ethnicity, and ecology. Rather, straight linearity cuts across a newly graphic space, apportioning unknown continents sight unseen. Schmidt highlights this raya, this one here, which is the zone of demarcation, as an absolute technical innovation, linking space and law at one and the same time. A purely geometric boundary coordinates terrestrial relations via the abstraction of a divisible grid, as opposed to an autochthonous lived relation to territory and resources. The shifting linear morphology of the map started increasingly to serve as a performative tool from this point on. It actively produced the space that it described. That's a sort of a baseline definition of performativity. The act of mapping enacted ownership. Following this precedent, European powers increasingly relied on cartographic grids and lines to order the globe and apportion its interterritorial relations on increasingly fine-grained levels. By the 16th and 17th centuries, world maps, such as those by Mercator, featured the full lattice of meridians and parallels at the high point of mercantile capitalism. Navigators and treaty makers could now stake their claim by simple reference to latitude and longitude. A critical distinction emerged between land and sea. Land territory became enclosed by treaty borders, while the open oceans were declared free for navigation. This freedom meant an absence of law, an anomie beyond the recognized lines. These so-called amity lines were agreements that European law would cease to hold beyond certain longitudinal slices, for instance, west of the Canary Island meridians, effectively sanctioning unrestricted conflict and conquest. The phrase, "no peace beyond the line," captured this mindset. Christian powers might observe legal norms when dealing with each other in Europe, but outside of those lines, in the vast terra incognita of the so-called global south and west, might makes right. The rise of global mapping, in other words, the cartographic revolution, went hand in hand with a Eurocentric partitioning of the world. Overlaying a grid on the earth was directly developed as a tool for colonizers to divide entire continents as if slicing up a checkerboard, reinforcing their imperial nomos through cartographic claim. Orientation, therefore, carried special ideological weight. The choice to place north at the top of maps, standardized in Europe during the so-called Age of Discovery, is a prime example. It corresponded with maritime power and placed Europe at the center and the top. The Mercator projection, referred to above, exaggerated this effect, enlarging Europe and minimizing the equator. Greenland appears the same size as Africa, despite being 14 times smaller. Direction becomes power. North is central, south becomes peripheral. Similarly, East and West become loaded categories. Europe defined itself as the Occident against an Oriental East. Oriental, obviously coming from Orient, because it used to be at the top of the map, centered on Jerusalem. These cardinal divisions were imperial fictions constructed by a political order that relied on papal bull and civilizing conquest. The naming of the Middle East, or Far East, reflects this perspective. As Medina Tolostanova notes, the north-south divide we so often hear about repackages the same logic as the old east-west divide, which we also hear a lot about. What she calls Australism is akin to Orientalism on the map's opposing axis today. This Vischer map from 1652 shows how cardinal direction was entwined with imperial ideology. The placement of Europe in the upper left, the most privileged spot, as if the headline of the page, and the positioning of Africa and America at the bottom serve as a striking illustration of the 17th century worldview. Here, north-south divide was already implied, long before those terms were formally used. I'm taking this from Tolostanova. The north, top orientation, the northern top orientation and Eurocentric layout literally put Europe above the rest. By the same token, Asia, which at the time was considered the civilized East, appears in the upper right, second in rank, while the southern continents, home to peoples Europeans viewed as savages and unchristian, occupy the lower, lesser positions. In maps like this, geography and cosmography blended with ideology. The cartouches and compass roses did more than decorate, they communicated the nomos by which cardinal direction shaped the relative legal stability of identity and authority. Okay, that's heavy stuff. And here's this nice mariner here that we can look at for a second. This concept of spatial nomos, the ordering and partitioning of space, goes not only to the era of mercantile interstate conflict and imperial conquest, but also to the emergence of more abstract systems of global economic control. To put it crudely, the shift from the mailed fist of military power to the enforceability of legal dictates marked the rise of what Max Weber called rational bourgeois capitalism. This economic system is defined by, and this is Weber, the systematic acquisition of profit by means of continuous rational enterprise, end quote. In this context, the Hanseatic cities, such as this one, emerged not as imperial capitals, but as nodal points in a globally dispersed regime of extraction, finance, and trade. Their mercantile operations displaced the spectacle of conquest with an infrastructural logic of administrative control rooted in maritime logistics, legal contracts, and commodity flows. This aligns with Robert Brenner's account of merchant capitalism, though he develops his account in the context of early modern England, where he argues that merchants were enriched through the commercial expansion of circuits of exchange rather than transforming the underlying relations of production, which remain largely pre-capitalist. Hanseatic trade did not repudiate colonial rule, rather it updated its mechanisms, turning spatial order into calculable risk and conquest into commodity exchange and production and exchange. Mostly commodity exchange. Hamburg has, of course, a special place on this map. This city was, sorry if this sounds like the information panel at a maritime museum or something like that, but it is going somewhere. This city was a central hub in the expansion of decentralized networks of trade, finance, and resource extraction that characterized the Hanseatic system of contract distribution and logistical innovation. And if anyone is interested in this topic, I learned so much from Philipp Dohlinger's book, The German Hansa, which I basically, all of this is condensed from. Yes, this is not Hamburg. This is Lübeck, but it's so nice. It's such these nice little guys here. Okay, so central to this expansion was Hamburg's involvement in the saltpeter, in the nitrate trade that developed in the wake of the War of the Pacific, which ended in 1883. In this conflict, Chile seized nitrate-rich territories from Peru and Bolivia, gaining control over the vast deposits of sodium nitrate in the Atacama Desert. And it's interesting to note that the Atacama Desert is still the site of massive conflict over resource extraction having to do with the lithium pools that are at once necessary for the production of batteries and environmentally devastating in the form of ecosystem, in the form of ecology. So while the Chilean state at the time oversaw territorial integration, it was mostly Hamburg merchant houses that capitalized on the economic opportunities this shift afforded. These firms quickly positioned themselves as indispensable intermediaries in the global nitrate economy in financing extraction, transport, and distribution of nitrate products. Originally used as a potent fertilizer in European agriculture and an alimentary preservative, nitrates would soon become essential in explosives production, which was very important for World War I. From soil and sausages to shrapnel, linking the desert mines of northern Chile to both the food supply chains and military-industrial complexes of Europe. Hanseatic companies established complex logistical and financial infrastructures that connected extraction sites directly to European markets via transatlantic shipping networks, insurance instruments, and commercial treaties. This expansion was not built on sovereignty, but on precision. Legal agreements, port infrastructures, shipping alliances, and commodity markets came to substitute for armies. This required just global maps, but new media for filling forms and filing them, for recording and retrieving records. This is where the administrative grid and the file as physical record really takes off as a civic rather than a strictly courtly information architecture. Weber's emphasis on the generalization of calculability for the emergence of the so-called spirit of capitalism receives its informatic profile here. This required that legal and administrative authority be co-constituted with the media infrastructure that manages its registers, administrative orderings, manifests, customs ledgers, and municipal archive grids. The documentary power of these media is simultaneously their ability to generalize to generalize the legal conditions for capital as a new system of wealth accumulation. Everyone now needs a file. This gives personhood, in the words of Cornelia Wisman, the spirit of officialdom. Hanseatic economic dominance in the nitrate industry was underpinned by significant advancements in navigational technology, which charged the administrative precision of files with geo-economic power. Hamburg-based shipping companies utilized machine chronometers, and there's one right there in the house. There's a lot. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of maritime stuff in the house. Highly precise timekeeping devices developed in the early 18th century to calculate longitudinal accuracy, and then eventually in the 19th century allowing local time at sea to be set to Greenwich Mean Time. The quadrant, oh no, that's not a quadrant. The quadrant, which I didn't find in the house, a legacy of the late medieval era, enhanced the precision of latitude measurements through celestial navigation, while dead reckoning, improved by sandglasses and carefully maintained logbooks, increased the accuracy and safety of long-distance voyages. These technological tools allowed Hanseatic firms to develop reproducible and efficient trade routes, linking the nitrate-rich coasts of northern Chile with the European markets. Okay, so Hamburg's commercial strength was grounded in sinking costs into technical and administrative infrastructure, which deepened epistemic mastery over space and time. To speak of Hanseatic navigational prowess is thus to speak of an entire media ecosystem, one that archived, transmitted, and deployed knowledge as part of an emergent capitalist logic of accumulation. The superior spatial rationality of the system gave Hamburg-based firms a competitive advantage in the nitrate economy, aligning their logistical mastery with emergent global mechanisms of global capital circulation. Indeed, the sophistication of this navigational infrastructure by the time of the 19th century was complemented by a previously developed ensemble of financial instruments which made investment in this infrastructure profitable. Merchant credit systems, commercial treaties, and joint shipping consortia positioned the Hanseatic League, much, much earlier, as a formation of pre-industrial finance capital. And here's a nice tableau of Schenker shipping invoices, which I thought was appropriate. Giovanni Arrighi's analysis in the long 20th century of the Genoese financial system as a prototype for the circulation logic of modern capitalism finds an approximate analog in the Hanseatic model. Like the Genoese, Hanseatic merchants leveraged dispersed networks of trade and credit, of legal authority, rather than relying on formal imperial power. So-called Wechselbriefe, bills of exchange, are a specific example of the increasing dispersal allowed by credit instruments on the way to modern paper currency markets. These enabled long-distance trade without the need to transport large sums of coin. Merchants could issue or receive these credit instruments at key Hanseatic cities like Lübeck or Bruges, redeemable at specified dates and places. This deferral of payment as paper promissory worked as a legally enforceable index of creditworthiness, which depended largely on guild affiliation. These mechanisms allowed for the fluid circulation of an increasingly generalized form of abstract value across Northern Europe and the Baltic. So this escalation of abstraction did not only grease the wheels of interstate commerce with novel navigational infrastructure and forms to be filled out of accounting systems. It also docks back at home port, where the merchant mariner digs in with his capital and erects a monument to himself. Even someone with no foreknowledge probably would not express surprise that the Chile House, designed by Fritz Höger in 1924, was built with the profits from the Chilean nitrate trade. It is no revelation to note that it glorifies the material outcome of a vast and asymmetrical system of extraction and accumulation. All this is written on its face, with its angular prow echoing the hull of a ship, directly depicting the marine infrastructures that connected the mineral-rich Atacama to the commercial arteries of Hamburg. The Chile House, often celebrated for its sculptural form and refined brick expressionism, cannot be fully understood outside of the structural logic of Hamburg's port system, which, following Manfredo Tafuri's critique of Fritz Schumacher's original plan for the city, functions as the really determining factor for its modern form. The port was the engine of capitalist urbanism. The city, a machine planned for surplus value extraction. This, for Tafuri, positioned port infrastructure as the script from which the spatial grammar of the city is written through logistics, circulation, and labor hierarchies. Urban planners like Schumacher did not plan, this is Tafuri's account, in opposition to the heteronomies of market competition, but rather to accommodate it with an aesthetic organicist finery, rationalizing space to serve capital imperatives in the integrated zoning of warehouses, custom stations, worker housing, and transport corridors. Civic ideals of harmony and order are rendered in an expressionist facade, concealing the deeper logic of capital accumulation that animated the city's expansion. And I hope it's clear that I'm not ad hoc brutally criticizing the layout of Hamburg, a city that I think is very beautiful and that I love, or the Chile House, a building that I love very much. This is just about the sort of limits of the aestheticization of form in contrast to the sort of the capital logic of urban planning and the development of city infrastructure. So it's about limits, not about saying it's all bad for some reason, which is not at all what I'm saying. Okay. So within this framework, the Chile House is an almost quaint theater of ideology. Its expressive massing, dramatic angles, and meticulous craftsmanship straightforwardly aestheticize the brutality of the extractive history it glorifies. From its fixed port of call, its form facilitates an optical ascent. This is at least my experience of the building. The eye is sort of orchestrated upwards across its prow, expressed in the 4.8 million clinker bricks arrayed in a grid across its reinforced concrete structure, imposing a vertical rhythm to its stepped setbacks and ornamental maritime references. As a work of architectural spectacle, it contributes to a visual regime that both admits and mystifies its conditions of representation. By this I mean that it substitutes aesthetic continuity and symbolic unity for social reconciliation. The false harmony of the plan in a social order structured by the opposition of class interests, the aesthetic expressive unity of a monument on the city map that represents plunder by contract and credit. Behind both lies a persistent technicist illusion, to cite Tafuri once more. The belief that spatial organization alone can resolve social contradictions of industrial capitalism. We have been discussing the media of early market creation as a continuance by other means of imperial expansion. However, even an urban scene as conscientiously and humanely planned as Hamburg's, from its origins to its present most progressive renewal efforts, are structured by compulsory strategies of spatial control, aligning everyday life with the rhythms of production. In Schumacher's case, and those of service consumption and real estate speculation in the present. In this light, the Chile House is less a building than an ornamental cartouche on the map of the city, an instrument for reading the spatial grammar of ongoing administrative, technological, and juridical systems that underwrite the movement of resources across continents. It indexes a world where space is not merely occupied, but measured, gridded, and partitioned according to the demands of circulation. This monument finds a strange double, I think, in the domestic architecture of Darboven's house, where a different kind of spatial logic is at play. Objects do not settle into fixed roles here, but instead modify the flow of attention, interrupting successive perceptual experience with unexpected detours, peripheral stains, and the crystallization of tableaux that at times barely hang together. As an environment, it is distracting without being misleading. And still one world, but not a reconciled one. Wiener concurs, as ever. After all, he offers that he and Hanne, we suppose, are not situated by the exact English euphemism of ships passing in the night, but are instead in a position, quote, caught between ships passing, end quote. Global linear thinking makes this position compulsory in a world held together less by dreams of shared meaning than by shared capture by logistics. In this sense, Darboven's dromos traverse and enact this system without simply reproducing it. Through accumulation, through the overcoding of signifying practices with homogeneous grids that still never fully totalize what they touch. The question then is not simply how maps represent the world, but how they make them. Not how buildings organize space, but how they betray the systems they serve. Darboven's practice has no words to offer about this. But the tools for encompassing these questions are undoubtedly there. How to think from within the grid without being bound by it. How to navigate this particular world mapped onto the globe whose closed unity appears on condition of being irretrievably divided. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much for this final presentation of today. We now have the opportunity, if there's still energy left, to ask some questions. Maybe we can open up the window again, the door, or...
I think maybe a drink is in order.
Yeah, I mean, if you're also available later on for questions and when we're having a drink, but let's wait for a moment maybe. Yes, of course.
Thank you for that super rich and fascinating and eloquent talk. I really enjoyed it. And it's kind of spinning around my head. I don't have a question. I just want you to repeat a phrase that you said about the relation between the house and the contents. And you said something like, it's not a container of them.
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah.
I love that, but I can't remember exactly
I
what
mean,
it
I
was.
guess I was saying, I don't really consider it a collection in a strict sense.
Yeah.
It's rather like this place that collections emerge from. So it doesn't have, I don't, or at least that's how I want to think about it, I should say, is that it sort of forgoes the structural hierarchies of object type that go into building a collection, right? It's not one particular object above others. It's an amassing of things that then emerge as these sort of closed collections and tableaus in a particular work. In a way, it's like the, Leibniz or Quartet 88 or Kulturgeschichte they these names, these titles, they give the collection its texture as a collection. The rest is something far more interesting to me, and far less bound up with what I think of as the sort of logic of a collection, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful way to express it and look at it. That's why I'm thank you for repeating it.
Yeah, thank you.
I think, okay.
Excuse me, didn't she reference her father at the beginning as a collector also?
Yeah.
Do we know what the father collected?
No, it's a great question, though. His name was Caesar. What a name.
Maybe his are all the heads.
Kaiser.
Maybe his are the heads of poets, statesmen, and Beethoven.
Maybe.
Mm.
Yeah. I wonder.
Thank you again. We now have a small intermission until 7 o'clock when dinner will be served. Eke Bippos, if you're available for a tour now, Anne Merpo, please join me then as well. And if Agatha Klaus is already here, I'm not sure, I haven't seen her yet, please contact me. Otherwise, thank you very much. Milan, I give the word to you.
Thank you. So the night isn't over, the day isn't over, although it's been rich already. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of the speakers. Some of you were able to participate with very short notice, which I really appreciate, and I'm incredibly grateful for. Also, I hope that next year we'll be able to do around 2 of the symposium. It seems like there are more questions. Maybe there are some that might return. Maybe new speakers will also enter the foray. But it seems like there's an urgent need to address this house, but also to think of it in terms of changing times and a changing zeitgeist around Hanne Darboven's oeuvre. I would also like to thank the Hanne Darboven Stiftung. I'd like to thank the Kunstverein team, Galerie Sputmagas. Thanks also to you, Philips Auctioneers, Donkey, and the Behörde für Kultur und Medien, Hamburg. The rest of the night is outside. If you'd like to take your things out with you, you can deposit them in the kitchen if you want, or in the hallway, but we'll be closing off the building here to protect these beautiful hardwood floors. There's going to be food outside from 7 on. There will be music and a concert with New York at 10 o'clock. Thank you so much for being here with us today.